Hey there, everybody. It's been a minute, but with Azurite Seas releasing soon, I'm super excited about Lorcana. And if your experience is anything like mine, the first chance you'll have to play with a lot of these cards in paper will be in the form of limited events this weekend. So I thought, why not make a little guide for limited? I have a pretty good experience playing both draft and sealed in Lorcana, probably much more than a lot of other competitive players. And I've tended to do pretty well, so I thought I might be a good person to make a guide for something like this. For this guide, I'm going to be operating under the assumption that you already know the rules for drafting and playing sealed in Lorcana, so that I don't have to go through all of that stuff. But because I do think it might be the first experience a lot of people have with, we'll say, strategy and theory in Limited, I will be starting with some things that I consider to be basics that a lot of people may not know. The first tip I want to give is that evasives win games. If you come from a Magic the Gathering background like I do, you might be familiar with the idea that flyers in Limited tend to be quite strong because they're difficult to block. And in Lorcana, evasives are actually better than flyers are in Magic the Gathering. The reason for that is primarily that they're difficult to deal with. You can't challenge them with most characters, and there's almost no removal in Lorcana Limited, which means that an unanswered evasive character can easily take over a game on its own. And I think that really has to alter your pick order, and it's something you have to be very cognizant of while building your deck to make sure that you have ways to answer threats that your opponent plays with evasive, so you don't just get cheesed out. The next thing I want to mention is that stats are king in Lorcana Limited. If one player doesn't win with an unanswered evasive, most games tend to turn into mid-range board control battles, and the player who has the bigger characters tends to sort of have more in play when the dust settles, which leads to them eventually winning the game some number of turns later. And the best way to be the person who wins the board control battle is to have the characters with higher stats. I think there are a couple important corollaries to the idea that stats are king. First is that lore pips actually are a little bit overrated in Lorcana Limited. It's not to say they're bad, it's not even to say that they're necessarily worse than strength or willpower, but ultimately, if you're trying to jockey for board position, lore tends to not do that for you as well as strength and willpower do. And it can be difficult to evaluate how strong lore is. It's the sort of thing where the more 2 lore pip characters you have in your deck, the better 2 lore pip characters become. If you only have 1 or 2, then they're usually not very good because it's difficult to leverage them into a win. So it's often easier to lean on strength and willpower as the means by which you control the board and then win the game with a huge advantage in the late game. And then another thing to note about stats being king is that it tends to mean that items and actions are pretty bad in Limited. Characters challenge, characters quest, characters win the game. Ultimately, most items and actions can't do those things. Obviously, there are exceptions, and they typically are actions and items that act as removal or card advantage engines. I think most other actions and items tend to be quite bad, and you should be trying to stay away from them for the most part. One thing you'll want to be thinking about when drafting a Lorcana deck is that there tends to be a relatively low number of 5-drops, 6-drops, and 7-drops relative to the number of 3-drops and 4-drops in a Lorcana set, but those late game cards are really, really powerful and really, really important in winning games of Lorcana Limited. So I think you should be picking them early and often to make sure that you have a decent number for your deck, and then you can focus on picking up the 3-drops and 4-drops, which tend to be more abundant a little bit later on in the packs. And then one last thing I want to get into before talking about set-specific stuff is that in draft, you're going to be picking a total of 48 cards and playing a 40-card deck, which means that you can only cut 8 of the cards you take, and you have to play the remaining 40. Now, that usually means that you're going to have a few cards that are not particularly good, and there's kind of nothing you can do to avoid that, but what you really want to be doing is playing inkables in those slots, even if the card is bad and you basically never want to play it. A bad inkable is way less of a detriment to your deck than a bad uninkable. So if it comes down to, the second to last pick in a pack and both cards are completely atrocious, take the inkable one if you have a choice. It will definitely pay off in the long run. Okay, now let's dive into the actual cards in Azurite Sea. So the way I'm going to do this is that I'm going to look at the commons and uncommons, and I'm going to go through them by cost. So I'm going to start at the 1-drops, go through all the way to the 7-drops, and talk about first what the best cards at that cost are at common and uncommon, and then I'm going to talk about what a good baseline stat line is for a card at that cost. I won't talk about every single card, it would just take too long, but that gives you a good idea of what you should be comparing cards to in your head as you go through and make picks in a draft. All right, so starting with the 1-drops, and this one is pretty easy. There are actually only 2 good ones. The first is Moana, and I actually think this is probably the best 1-drop in the set. A 3/2 stat line for a 1-drop is just extremely good. It's going to come into play, it's going to quest once or twice, and then your opponent's still going to have to trade something with it to take it off the board. And that's pretty good value for a 1-drop. Far better than you'll get with most cards. And the next best, in my opinion, is Diablo. Diablo has the potential to be better than Moana. If you have a bunch of support cards or other pump effects in your deck, then Diablo obviously has the potential of trading with a card and getting you a card when it is banished. But most likely Diablo is just going to quest for 1 and then sort of prevent your opponent from questing 1 time and then draw you a card afterward, which is a pretty good card for a 1-drop, but certainly neither of these cards are going to be game-breaking. As far as Moana is concerned, you certainly do not have to play captains to make her good. She's going to be just fine and would probably still be the best 1-drop if you had no captains in your deck and she had the text line that basically said she can never challenge ever. Obviously, having a couple in your deck certainly improves her value, lets her trade on your terms sometimes, which is a nice upside. But yeah, I think the typical play pattern with Moana is just going to be you play it and then it quests once or twice and then your opponent trades with like a 2/2 or a 2/3 or something like that. The next best 1-drop after those 2 might actually be Myrtle Edmonds, just because of the 1/3 stat line. I don't think that 2/2s like Yokai or Toodles are very good in this format, and I'll get to it in a second, but there are actually 4 2/3s for 2 at common in this format, which means that 2/2s are particularly bad, and although I think you're likely to end up with, a couple of these in your deck just because they're inkable and you can play them, you're going to want to put them in your inkwell the vast majority of the time, and that includes on turn 1. I think that if I have Yokai in my opening hand, I'm going to ink it on turn 1 and pass like 90% of the time. The only exception to that would be if I had an extremely aggressive start and I wanted to leverage as much tempo as I possibly could. There aren't a huge number of really strong 2-drops in this format. I think that the best 2-cost cards are Sail the Azurite Sea and Twinfire. Sail the Azurite Sea just lets you take advantage of the fact that there aren't a ton of good early game plays in the format and just jump straight to the mid and late game where you can play, bigger, beefier threats and leverage more out of each individual card. And Twinfire, of course, is just very strong. It's a removal card. There's just very, very little removal in Lorcana Limited, and Twinfire actually can sometimes be 2 removal spells, which is obviously very, very good and probably the best 2-cost card and certainly one of the best commons and uncommons in the entire format. The best characters at common and uncommon are probably Mr. Arrow, which is by far the most aggressive character that we have at 1 or 2 in this format. And it should be pretty good, should easily be able to get 2 quests in. It's the sort of card that could easily win games if you could play a very good bodyguard or something on turn 3 or 4. And then Mr. Smee, which is just really important. You need to have some number of cards in your deck that can answer evasives. And so having that on a 2-drop where there are not a ton of great 2-drops anyway is really nice. It challenges very favorably into the 3-drop Tinkerbell, which is certainly one of the very best commons in the format, and so I think that, you're never going to be unhappy to have Mr. Smee in your deck. By far the most common stat line at 2 is the 2/3 stat line, and there are actually a total of 4 cards at common with this stat line, which means that the early game is definitely going to revolve around the 2/3 body. Again, this is why I think 2/2s for 1 in this format are going to be particularly bad. Yeah, I think this is just a good baseline and the sort of thing that you want to fill out the bulk of your 2-drops in most decks. As far as other cards, there's a couple 1/4s like Simba, and I think they're slightly worse than 2/3s, but certainly still very serviceable as 2-drops. And then there are a couple 1/3s with abilities like Grand Councilwoman and Aunt Cass, which I think are slightly worse than the 1/4s and the 2/3s, but certainly have some potential, especially if you can utilize their abilities. Alright, on to the 3-drops, and here is where Azurite Sea starts to get really exciting. There are 2 absolutely bonkers 3-drops, in my opinion, at common and uncommon, respectively. And the first is Tinkerbell, and this is probably going to be the card you hear the most complaints about when people are playing a draft of this format. A 1/3 that quests for 2 and has evasive is crazy. We saw this in set 2 with Minnie Mouse, and it was a huge problem in that limited format, and I suspect that this Tinkerbell is going to be similarly problematic. It can take over a game on its own. Your opponent basically has to find an answer to it within a few turns, or you're going to win the game. Pleakley is another card that's absolutely crazy. It almost looks like there's a downside here, but actually I think it's an upside in Limited for the most part. This is a 3/4, which by the way is a very good stat line for a 3-drop in pretty much any Limited format. But the fact that this is also going to turn your bad 1-drop, your bad 2/2, into ramp is crazy. And this is the sort of card that actually makes me want to play 1-drops. I think for the most part, as I mentioned previously, you're going to want to ink those where possible. But if you have a Pleakley in your hand, yeah, absolutely slam it into play. You're going to get at least 1 lore out of it and then an ink. Yeah, a very, very powerful card. It's going to win games for sure. I think that Dale is another really good 3-drop. It's a 3/4 the quest for 2. Yes, it's going to come into play exerted most of the time, but on curve, it's very unlikely your opponent is going to have a good way to trade into this. So I think that that mostly mitigates the downside. I do think later on in the game, you're likely to have to ink it, otherwise it could potentially get eaten. But yeah, on curve, very, very strong, very aggressive quest for 2. Yeah, just great all around. Then Hubert has a very similar stat line, 3/4. Quest for 1 less, but also never comes into play exerted. I think probably slightly worse, but again, a 3/4 stat line just very, very good at a 3-drop in general. Then I want to give a quick shout out to Basil just as a card that answers Tinkerbell and evasives in general, and could of course quest as an evasive itself if you need. I think pretty good overall. And after that, I think we can talk about Hot Potato, which is just a general removal spell. I think it's, worse than Twin Fire, but it is inkable, which has some upside in some situations. After that, there's a whole bunch of 3/3s that have some effect. I think most of these are pretty good, and you won't be unhappy to play them in your deck, although I wouldn't pick them very highly in draft, just in part due to the fact that there are so many good 3-drops that you're going to have a glut of them most of the time anyway. These are the sorts of cards you're happy to pick in the mid to late pack area, and use them to fill out your deck. I would be wary of any 2/3s or worse stat lines. There are a couple that have some decent abilities and you might want to play, but for the most part, the 2/3 stat line is going to be pretty bad just due to the prevalence of 3/3s and better stat lines, which are really going to invalidate those 2/3s. I think the 2 best 4-drops in the format are probably Murkowski and Pluto. Murkowski is just another very good aggressive evasive threat, and it actually lines up very well against 3-drop Tinkerbell, which is another point in its favor. And then Pluto, I think, is also extremely strong. Pluto is interesting in the sense that it's the kind of card that can really improve other cards in your deck. So I didn't mention the 1/3, the quest for 3 Magic Broom with the 3-drops, in part because I do think that stat line can be a liability with so many 3/3s for 3 flying around. But if you can get 1 or even 2 Plutos, that card goes way up in value. And I could see a curve like 1-drop into Mr. Arrow into Magic Broom into Pluto being almost impossible to beat, especially if you go first. So yeah, I think these 2 cards very, very powerful at 4. Iago is another card to really keep your eye out for. I'm not 100% sure how good it's going to be, but it does remind me a lot of the Flotsam from Ursula's Return, which was an extremely powerful card. Now, 4 is a decent bit more than 3 as far as a recurred threat goes, but this is the sort of card that's going to take over a game if it goes super long. You can challenge into something, take it out, and then just keep repeating it, turn after turn after turn after turn. If your opponent can't end the game quickly, you will eventually take board control from them with it. As far as a baseline for stats go at 4, I do think that the Walrus and Chief Bogo tend to be pretty good cards that you'd always be happy to play in your deck. I think they line up quite well against the cards that come before them on the curve and have pretty good stats overall. I'll also give a quick shout out to the Chip and Dale cards. I don't think these are necessarily super powerful, but the fact that there are a bunch of Chip and Dale cards that are mostly playable on their own and also get better with copies of other Chip and Dale cards is pretty cool, and I think something you want to keep an eye on while you're drafting. There is not a huge number of good 5-drops in the set. I do think Abu and Jim Hawkins stand out to me as being pretty good. Abu is going to come down, it's going to likely eat a character, then sit and play as a decently sized character that can quest for 2. Jim can sometimes function as removal, and otherwise it's just a very good statted card. The fact that these cards are uninkable I don't think is that big of a deal. Beyond that, there really aren't any standouts at 5, but I will note that there just aren't that many 5-drops overall, and almost all of them are decently playable. I do think that even the mediocre ones are going to have to be picked somewhat highly, because if you don't take them, someone else will, and you're going to end up with no late game in your deck, and I think that's a real risk and something that you want to avoid falling into. There will not be enough 5, 6, and 7-drops in the draft pool for every single player to have the ideal number of these cards, and yeah, I guess you don't want that to be you. You'd rather have someone else be the person who has no late game in their deck. Scar and Basil are actually the only two common or uncommon 6-drops in the entire format. Again, neither of these are necessarily game-breaking. I do think if you can shift Basil, it has the potential to be game-breaking, although it's not necessarily a 6-drop in that case. At any rate, yeah, you're going to have to pick these cards decently highly. There just isn't that much late game. Obviously, you know, some of the lack of late game common and uncommon cards is supplemented by the fact that there will be an increased number of higher rarity cards, but the reality is that you can't count on rares, super rares, or legendaries when filling out your draft deck. So I think, you know, especially early on when you don't have your 5, 6, and 7 sorted yet, I do think you should be taking them highly to make sure that you don't have a gap there at the end of the draft. And that leaves us with the lone common or uncommon 7-drop in the entire format, which is Tinkerbell. I could repeat what I've previously said about 5s and 6s here. Obviously, you do want some late game in your deck, and Tinkerbell is a perfectly reasonable card. I do think that 7 can sometimes be hard to get to and a little bit slow. Still, I think having 1 or 2 Tinkerbells in your deck is not going to be a problem, and it will be pretty good when it's in play. Okay, so that's my general rundown of the commons and uncommons in the set. Now, next, I just want to give my first impressions without ever having played the format about how I think it's going to play out. First of all, between Murkowski and Tinkerbell, especially with Tinkerbell at common, I think that this format is going to end pretty quickly in some games. I think some games someone's going to slam a Tinkerbell, their opponent won't have any way to deal with it, and then they will just easily quest for the win. So make sure that you have answers to Tinkerbell in your deck. You know, Murkowski as well, obviously. And Murkowski, of course, is both a threat and an answer to Tinkerbell, which is very sweet. But yeah, things like Basil, Mistress Me are going to be valuable to have in your deck. Then next, again, I don't think there's a large number of 1 and 2 drops that are super powerful. As far as like aggro goes, it's kind of just Mr. Arrow at 2. So I don't think that outside of those evasives, too many games are going to be ending super quickly, and I think that a lot of them are going to turn into slogfests overall. So late game's going to be important. Beyond that, I just want to give a little bit of insight about how I mulligan in Limited. I do think that some people do not mulligan aggressively enough in Draft and Sealed, and by that I mean a lot of your 2s, 3s, 4s are going to be pretty replaceable, and so if you have a 2-drop and a 3-drop in your hand, I think that you should be aggressively mulliganing for whatever the best cards in your deck are. You know, whatever your best 5-drop is probably going to win you a lot of games if you can play it. So just doing what you can to get that in your opening hand is a good idea. Likewise, I do think that some people mulligan their powerful late game cards more often than they should. And I think part of the problem there is that in Constructed, right, when you're playing Lorcana normally, 5s and 6s are often the sorts of cards you don't want to keep in your opening hand and instead look for a more powerful start. Because so many of the early game cards are replaceable and do very similar things, it doesn't really matter what you're playing so much in the early game. And if your best card in your deck is an uninkable 6-drop, I think you should absolutely just be keeping it in your opening hand basically every time. I think that card is going to win you more games than whatever your best 2-drop is compared to, you know, your replacement level 2-drop. So mulligan aggressively for your best cards, and if you have your best cards in your opener, just keep them. You know, obviously if you have 2 uninkable 6-drops, maybe don't keep both of them, but overall I do think that strategy is going to help some amount. The next thing I want to mention is to be wary of board stalls. So something that can happen in a limited game of Lorcana is that you don't have very favorable quests, because if you quest with your 3/4, your opponent can challenge with your 4/4, and they don't want to quest with their 4/4 because then you can challenge with your 2/2 and your support character. And so sometimes there's a tendency for boards to go wide where you have 4 or 5 characters in play, your opponent has 4 or 5 characters in play. When that happens, there is a tension that builds up where you each get more and more lore pips in play, and at some point, someone is going to win the game by questing with all of their characters. And yes, if your opponent quests with all of their characters, you might get some favorable trades, but they're going to go to 13, 14 lore. Then you're going to spend your whole turn challenging down some of their characters, and they're going to be left with like 2 lore pips in play, plus 1 they played on their previous turn. Then they're going to quest up to 17, and you're going to be ahead on board at this point, but it's often too late to come back. So in a board stall, you have to be wary of who is going to be able to quest for the win, and you want it to be you. You want to be the person who turns your entire board sideways first. But you can't do it too soon. If you do it too soon, then they're going to get favorable trades. You're only going to get to 16 lore, and then it's not going to be enough to cross the finish line before your opponent uses their wider board to sort of catch up. But yeah, it's just something to be wary of, the tension that builds in a board stall. And it's something you have to get a feel for, and you may have to just try it at one point if you're looking for a good rule of thumb. Certainly if you've got 4 or 5 characters in play and you can quest to 15 lore, and your opponent won't be able to challenge them all down, it's a reasonable chance that if you just quest with everything, you'll win the game that way. The idea here is that when you do quest with a bunch of characters, not only are you getting the lore, but you're also buying time, because your opponent can't quest. When you quest with a full board in a board stall, your opponent has to spend their entire turn challenging down your characters or you'll win the game, which buys you time, right? You get up to 14 lore, your opponent stays at 6. Then you get up to 17 lore, your opponent stays at 6. Yes, at this point, maybe they have 3-4 more characters than you in play, but it's often inevitable that you'll get to 20 before they're able to get to 20. Well, if you're still with me, thank you for sticking around this far. Yeah, I'm a little bit rusty talking to the camera, but I think, it was fun overall. I do think that there's kind of a dearth of draft and sealed content on YouTube, especially for Lorcana. I think there's a couple podcasts and stuff, but I thought that it'd be fun. Yeah, give a little insight. I know I've played a lot more draft than most people have, so I probably have some useful information to share. And yeah, I'm super excited to play this weekend. Obviously, some of my takes were probably wrong, and I'm sure I missed some cards. It's very hard to not miss a card in an entire set of Lorcana, but yeah, I'm super excited to give it a try, and I hope you have fun drafting this weekend. I know I will. If you have any ideas, think I missed something, have anything you think I should have talked about, throw it in the comments. Yeah, and again, thank you for watching. I'll catch you next time.